All right, as I'm getting set up here, I do want to take just a minute and remind you all that because this is the first week of the month, it is Fellowship Lunch Week. So when today's service is over, we'd invite you to head across the parking lot. The trip there, you may have to get a tether of some kind as you try to cross the parking lot as you deal with the winds here in town. It's much easier to go back to your car, just kind of stand outside the door and stick your arms out and the wind will do the rest. If you brought food for lunch today, I do want to also encourage you, as we did last month, to grab a green slip when you get over to when you get back over to the gym. If you brought a dish, take a second and fill it out. Introduce us to what we're going to enjoy, especially for the sake of people who have dietary concerns. If you've got anything you wanted to share with them so they know what they're digging into, it'd be helpful. You'll notice, actually, some of these little cards are starting to show up more and more. Pastor Taylor's a name tag, a card kind of person. For example, if you're over on this side of the congregation and you're over here at this side of the sanctuary, you may have noticed a new card in your pews that actually showed up a couple of weeks ago. Looks a little something like this. If you're new here and sitting on this side of the church, we'd invite you to take just a second and connect with us. Fill out one of these cards and let us know who you are so we can say hi to you. You guys, all of you have been here before, so it's not a problem. I'm getting there, okay? We're doing these by hand. These are custom made. But you'll see connect cards. As time goes on, we're going to add more cards, things like prayer requests. You can fill these out, drop these in an offering in the offering plate as it goes by so that we can get your prayer requests to our prayer person before that time of our service. We'll eventually have more cards too, things like how to respond to your message. They'll all fit right nicely in with the offering envelope. And that actually, wait a second, I'm noticing my computer isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing right now. The offering envelope actually leads me to my message for today, my introduction, because this church, because our bulletin tends to be very coloring book and activity friendly, you guys don't do it very often, but I've had churches before where these things get used for all kinds of things. Some of you know very well about the idea of taking these envelopes and very gently pulling them apart, and now all of a sudden you have doodle pads. Anybody need the doodle pad? Anybody thankful that we put doodle pads in your bulletins? Yeah, a few of you are. How many of you already finished the word search? Thanks, Jody. Good job, Starla. So the reason I mention this is because I ran across a really funny story. My kids have done things with these for years, and there was a guy who did something with one of these offering envelopes that I had never considered before. He got married because of one. And I'm not talking like spiritual married to Jesus. I mean like legit, he ended up getting married because of these. Anybody familiar with Tommy and Eddie, a couple of guys that are often known as the Skit Guys? Some of you are familiar with the Skit Guys. For those of you who aren't, it's a comedy troupe. They often do Christian stories and skits. They're famous on YouTube. I have to admit, they were really big probably about 10 or 15 years ago. They've gotten weird recently, so we don't use them very much anymore. But one of the ones that they shared is the story of this one time when Eddie was at church, and he couldn't help but notice that there was a beautiful lady sitting a couple of rows over, and he tells this story, by the way, in a message he calls Check the Box. He's at church, and he notices a couple of seats over, there's a beautiful lady that he's never noticed before. Now, mind you, Tommy's 27 years old at this point. But if you know Tommy, this is Eddie, I'm sorry. If you know Eddie, you know that though he might look 27 or 47 or whatever, he is still very much in his mind, he's 7 years old. He is a big kid. And so he had no problem doing like a typical 7-year-old would do, rip it open and write a note on it. And he did the ultimate 7-year-old note, the check the box note. He wrote on this offering envelope, "Do you like me? Yes? No." Folded it up and passed it on. He said that he was dying, watching the note get passed over, and he was about to have a full-blown meltdown as it came back to him. And I'm I've already kind of alluded to this already. Do you think that he got a positive response when Stephanie sent the note back? She actually checked neither box, but instead wrote this: maybe buy me something and we'll see. So what did he do? He bought her something. They got married eventually, and it was a happily ever after. It's exciting for him, and it's kind of fun for us as he relates that story. Like I said, it's called Check the Box. You can look it up online. I would show it, but I have to be mindful of what we show on our YouTube channel. I have to take just a second here and note, some of you really enjoyed Alexis's special music presentation last week, but those of you who are watching along online, a few of you noted, I couldn't hear it. Well, part of this is because we have to be careful with copyright concerns. We do our worship services here in person, but also mindful that there are people in our church family who are watching along online. And as we broadcast, there are certain protocols that these online services use. So we did have to keep the music down so that the whole stream didn't get wiped out this past week. If you wanted to hear the service, that's unfortunately what it meant. So sorry about that. Just come and join us in person, okay? We actually have people here today who watched along online and decided it's probably better in person, and I hope it is so far. So, we talk about this idea of the check the box note, and he says that the reason people check the box, it's actually something that we have this natural desire for in the first place. As I was getting in my car this morning, because Andrew and I drove separately, I actually called out as I was leaving, "Love you," and I intentionally closed my door a little slowly just because I wanted to hear it come back. Anybody know that feeling of just wanting to hear that reply? You like to hear that affirmation, and it's not just between husband and wife, but as a child. I'd call out in the darkness to my parents, "Good night, Mom. Good night, Dad. I love you." I love you. I love you. I love you too. And it was all okay, right? We do that. We have this natural desire for affirmation and to just know that somebody cares about us. We now turn to our Bible story for today. Let's talk about Jacob. Jacob, as I talked about last week, Jacob is one of the sons of Isaac. Isaac did the best he could, and we jokingly pointed out last week that things were always a lot better when Isaac wasn't in control. When Isaac was in the driver's seat, the story went off the rails pretty quickly. But when somebody else was in control, when he just left it by faith in someone else's hands, it's amazing how often God did something wonderful to help bless and to answer all of Isaac's desires. Well, one of Isaac's desires was for a child. And we know that their story contains about a 20-year gap where they wanted a child but could not have it. And finally, one day, God, in control, gives them that long-awaited child that they wanted. But God was in a generous mood. And it was a buy one, get one free special, blessing Isaac and Rebekah with twins. Twins are a blessing. Blessing is one of many words you could use for twins, though. As we've discovered, as Isaac and Rebekah discovered, as anybody who's read the book of Genesis has discovered, there is quite a bit of story of the ups and many downs of these twins. We're going to talk today specifically about one of them, Jacob. Sorry, Esau didn't qualify for a message in this series. When it comes to Jacob, Jacob wanted one thing in life, and only God could provide it. What is that thing? Let's discover it together in our message that I'm calling Wrestled. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this beautiful day that you've given to us, for the opportunity to gather together to worship you. Lord, I pray that as some of us have arrived here today also wrestling, also seeking after something that only you can provide. I pray that we would find it, but more importantly, find you today. So Lord, be with us and bless us in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So, story of Jacob starts in Genesis 25, so I want you to open there. And as you're opening there, let's take just a minute and make sure we're all on the same page. I jokingly said for the last couple of weeks that Sarah was one of the smallest major characters of the Bible. Her name appears several times, not only in the Old Testament, not just in Genesis, but shows up in some of the later writings, but also shows up in the New Testament, shows up in the Hall of Faith and all of those things. But Sarah is still only mentioned about 26 times. She is one of the smaller major characters. And I said last week that much like her mom, her son, or Isaac, or much like his mom, Isaac is also one of the smallest major characters in the Bible. Isaac only shows up in a handful of chapters in his own section, and he quickly gets outshone and demoted to a minor character over a bowl of lentil soup. We're already talking about soup more than we're talking about Isaac. Isaac quickly fades from memory, and admittedly, if I were to ask you the name of the patriarchs, he's the one that many people will more likely struggle with. Abraham, we know. We sang a song about Father Abraham. We sing a song about Jacob's ladder. Did we sing a song about Isaac? Yeah, there you go. Now, on the flip side, where Isaac is one of the smallest major characters of the Bible, dare I say that Jacob is one of the biggest major characters in the Bible. I was amazed when I realized just how present and how important as far as references and his overall, just his presence is, even if he's not physically present in a story. Jacob appears in Genesis 25 and dies in Genesis 49. He is present or looms over nearly every story in half of this book. Half of the book of Genesis, either Jacob is there or everybody's worried about how he's going to respond when he finds out what happened. More than that, he's mentioned more than 350 times in the Bible by name, and his name is used in the New Testament alone more than Sarah is mentioned total. And that's not even using his other name. This is just typing in Jacob to a search engine. Jacob's story, as I mentioned, starts with Genesis 25. In Genesis 25, verse 22, which we read last week, but we'll put ourselves back on the same page again. Genesis 25 and verse 22 is where Jacob's story begins. There were two children who struggled with each other in her womb. That's Rebekah's womb. So she went to ask the Lord about it. Why is this happening to me, she asked. And the Lord told her, the sons in your womb will become two nations. From the very beginning, the two nations will be rivals. One nation will be stronger than the other, and your older son will serve your younger son. That's kind of important. You'll find that out in a second. When the time came to give birth, Sarah discovered that she did indeed have twins. And the first was very red at birth and covered with thick hair like a fur coat, so they named him Esau. The other twin was born with his hand grasping Esau's heel, and they named him Jacob. What does Jacob mean? Some of you have a little note that the literal translation would be heel grabber, but a more symbolic representation is the word deceiver, supplanter, or trickster. So we find that from birth, we have two sons. One of them, the hairy red one, and the other one, the deceiver or the trickster. Gee, that's not already kind of putting an image into our mind about who these guys are, does it? This already has done a good job of helping us to know, before we know anything about them, we know who they're going to become. And sure enough, they live up to their name. As the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter. He was an outdoorsman, but Jacob had a quiet temperament, preferring to stay at home. Isaac loved Esau because he enjoyed eating the wild game that Esau brought home, but Rebekah loved Jacob. This verse points out something very crystal clear. We know that Isaac and Rebekah each chose a favorite twin. I'll tell you right now, I'm glad that it's children's church, so the kids aren't here, as I admit to you that Andrea and we don't have a favorite because all of them drive us crazy at some point or another. But there is something that stuck in my mind about the way that verse 28 said how they came to their favorite. Isaac loved Esau because Isaac loved food. Anybody surprised here to know that the dad liked the son who gave him food? Anybody shocked? No. Rebekah loved Jacob, period. And it leaves me scrambling with, well, why? What was her justification? And it can't help but make you think that when it came time to pick her favorite twin, that she had been influenced by what God had told her when he explained in verse 23 who the sons were and who they were going to become. And that left me with an uneasy question. And I mentioned this to Andrea. Would Rebekah have picked Jacob if God didn't say anything? Did God already put an impression in her mind of who this son was and who he was going to be, and she responded in kind based on how God had influenced her? It left us with a bit of a, in my mind as I wrestled with it, it was the question of, is this prescriptive or is this descriptive? Is this God saying that this is the way that things have to be, or is this God acknowledging that this is how things are just going to become? It kind of goes back to a conversation that you find back in Genesis chapter 3. The idea that Eve would yearn after her husband and he shall rule after her. There is a debate about, is that prescriptive and God saying that men must rule over, or is that descriptive? God acknowledging that this is just the way that things have become now that the relationships and things have changed the way that they have because of sin. And so there's this conversation from Genesis 3 now makes me think, would Rebekah have done anything different? Would she have picked Jacob if God didn't say anything? After all, there is that natural tendency to prefer the firstborn, right? If you don't believe me, how many of you have more than one kid? How many of you have more than one photo album? How many of you have more than one baby book? How many of you have more than one Gmail address set up for your kids to pass off to them when they get older? You don't have any. You weren't that generation. I'd hate to ask the second or third or fifth born. There is just this natural tendency to want to prefer the firstborn. Happened back then, happens today. But more than that, think about what we know about them. Would she have picked the deceiver if God hadn't have said something? Think about what we later discover about who Jacob is. We know that Jacob stole his birthright from his brother, right? The very next story about Jacob is the story of Esau being so hungry that he wants a bowl of stew from his homebody brother. And he says, I'll trade you your birthright for food. I know you need it, but I need something in return. What a sneaky guy. And we know that a couple of chapters later, he continued his sneaky, deceptive ways. He was very much a Jacob when he tricked his father and stole his blessing from his brother. Think about all of the work he did to pretend to be Esau and to flat out lie to his father's face in multiple occasions in order to get what he wanted. We saw that story in Genesis chapter 27, starting in verse 1. We talked about this a little bit when we dealt with Isaac. One day, Isaac was old. He was turning blind. He called for his son Esau, to his older son. Now, mind you, of course, these are twins. And they're not even that long of a gap, right? I mean, we have one son coming out, and the other son is holding on to him. The birth certificate would have probably said 1237 and 1237 in 5 seconds. But that 5 seconds made such a significant difference that he said, I need my older son. He said, my son. Yes, father, Esau replied. And he, like I said, called for him to go and prepare a meal for him. He says, prepare my favorite dish, bring it here for me to eat, and I will pronounce the blessing that belongs to you, my firstborn son, before I die. He called for him and he said, make me a dish. And what happened in this story? He got a dish, didn't he? It was a delicious dish made by some guy who was actually probably a bit more familiar with his way around a kitchen. And when Esau arrived and realized what had happened, because he called out to his father, and his father's like, oh, that was a good, wait, what are you bringing me? Lunch? I just had lunch. You made me lunch, right? Verse 36, Esau exclaimed, no wonder his name is Jacob, for now he has cheated me twice. First he took my rights as the firstborn, and now he's stolen my blessing. Oh, haven't you saved even one blessing for me, he said. And Isaac said to Esau, I made Jacob your master, and declared that all of his brothers will be his servants. I've guaranteed him an abundance of grain and wine. What's left for me to give you, my son? Esau pleaded, don't you even have one blessing for me? Oh, Father, bless me too. And Esau broke down and wept. At this point, your heart probably broke down a little bit too. You can't help but feel bad for Esau, right? Poor Esau. And his sadness turned to anger. From that time on, Esau hated Jacob because their father had given Jacob the blessing. And Esau began to scheme, I will soon be mourning my father's death, and then I'll kill my brother Jacob. But Rebekah heard about Esau's plans. So she sent for Jacob and told him, listen, Esau is consoling himself by plotting to kill you. So listen carefully, my son. Isn't Esau her son too? Get ready to flee to my brother Laban in Haran. If Rebekah had not interceded in this story, what would have happened to Jacob? It would have had a completely different and much shorter life, right? He wouldn't have gone through anything else that we know that he eventually goes through. Rebekah's intercession on his behalf on multiple occasions fundamentally changed his life, right? And so I'm once again wrestling with, would Rebekah have interceded on behalf of that trickster, that deceiver, that supplanter, if God hadn't interfered in the first place? Jacob, he stole the birthright from his brother. But is Jacob really completely at fault in this story? No. Because alternatively, we could look at the story from the alternative perspective, perhaps how Rebekah may have viewed it. Sure, Jacob may have stolen it, according to Esau, but you can also look at it from this side. Esau gave away his birthright to his brother for a bowl of soup. I will trade my debit card to you for an extra piece of garlic bread on the potluck line. Yeah, you see what I'm saying here, right? We said that he needed it. Did he really need it? Or did he just want it? He traded away something he didn't want for something he did, right? Another way of looking at this is that Jacob tricked his father and stole his blessing from his brother. And in fact, we know that there's blessing. We celebrated this with Isaac. It is by faith that Isaac promised blessings to the future sons, Jacob and Esau. We read this in Hebrews 11:20. But was that really the full story? What was that blessing like? We know how he reported it to Esau. I am going to make you, the one son is going to be the other son's servant. One son's going to get all the food, all the drink, all the authority, everything, and the other son is going to get nothing. But isn't there any blessing left for me? And the blessing, admittedly, that Esau received was pathetic. That was the blessing that Jacob was supposed to receive instead. So alternatively, Isaac was ready to give every blessing he had for his children, plural, to Esau alone. There is something to be said for the firstborn rights. There is something to be said for double portion. But I can't help but notice that somebody's getting 2 and somebody's getting 0. This story is twisted up and backwards, in all sorts of ways messed up. And it's so easy to make Jacob look like perpetual bad guy. But he's not alone in this. Esau made mistakes too. Isaac made mistakes too. And so once again, thinking about Rebekah, would Rebekah have picked Jacob if God didn't say anything? Which leads me to wonder, why would God say anything? And I can't help but feel like God knew that if God didn't intervene, would anyone have been on Team Jacob? Not his father, not his brother. Hey, she says, I want you to flee and go see my brother Laban. How well did that work out? We know that Laban tricked him, and we'll talk more about that story next week, don't worry. He eventually had children of his own. His firstborn child slept with and tried to take his father's servant, Bilhah, the servant of Rachel. Is Rachel important to Jacob? Oh, wow. So his oldest son is now trying to pull her away, like Rachel's servant away. By the way, as a reminder, that servant was the one who was the mother of Dan and Naphtali. His oldest son went behind his back to steal from him. His neighbor Shechem raped his daughter. Levi, Simeon, more of his children, killed his ally Hamor after Jacob had made peace with him. Judah sold Jacob's favorite son into slavery and told him that he was dead. His family betrayed him. His neighbors betrayed him. Everywhere he turned, his life was full of misery. And dare I say, nobody would have been Team Jacob if God wouldn't have at least encouraged Rebekah to step up and be Team Jacob. No, I'm not saying that Rebekah is totally in the right here, and I'm not saying that Jacob is he's totally faultless. He's not. He's far from faultless in his story. He did play favorites. He did take on multiple wives. He did try to, dare I say, continue many of the exact same generational sins that his dad and his grandpa had done to a magnitude of scale. He played favorites worse than Isaac had done, worse than Abraham had done with Isaac. Did Jacob turn Joseph into a bit of an idol? Sure did. Jacob is far from faultless in his story. But we find that in Jacob's story, a lot of his motivations is that really all he wanted was one thing in life. And it's only God, and what we discover is that only God could provide it. Because to every person around him that he went to get it, he couldn't. The one thing he wanted, only God could provide. Jacob, in Genesis 32, his life, he knows he's in trouble. He knows that Esau is coming. He is ready to become, he's ready to come to Esau and to trade out a gigantic, I'm sorry. Trade over a substantial portion of his wealth that he's accumulated. And he's afraid that he may end up giving, dare I say, his entire life because of it. He is ready to walk away from everything. And the night before, he has this encounter with Esau. He has a more important encounter with somebody else that I would say he's never met before, but we know that's not true. Because a few chapters earlier, he had gotten a glimpse of the stranger, or at least what he was capable of. You remember our song from earlier, Jacob's Ladder? Yeah. He caught a glimpse of God. Here, he gets the whole thing. In Genesis 32, starting in verse 24, where our scripture reading was, we are told that Jacob was all alone in camp, and a man came and wrestled with him until the dawn began to break. When this man saw that Jacob when this man saw that he would not win this match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of its socket. I had a funny little cartoon I was debating whether or not to show you. Anybody who has siblings knows the idea of stop hitting yourself, stop hitting yourself. I saw a cartoon that was basically the angel wrestling with Jacob and telling Jacob, stop hitting yourself, stop hitting yourself. And lo, he could not for, the angel. Anyway. Verse 26, this man said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. But Jacob said, I won't let you go unless you bless me. He knows that this isn't just any combatant. He knows that this is God. I wonder if this is the same man that Abraham had lunch with that day. I wonder if this is the same man that we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks when we get closer to Easter time. I will not let you go unless you bless me. Jacob wanted one thing in life, and only God could provide it. What did he want? He wanted to know that someone cared for him. That is a blessing in a nutshell. It is God's promise to provide, to protect, to acknowledge, to notice, to care. That's what a blessing is, basically, isn't it? And Jacob just desperately wanted to know that someone cared. Because his whole life he wrestled with, did my dad care? Does my brother care? He later finds out that will his sons, will his neighbors? Everywhere he turned, blessings became curses. And how sad is it to think that just a few generations earlier, going back to Abraham, the original intent of this family in the first place was that they were supposed to be a blessing to all peoples, to the entire world. And now here we are with a grandson who's not even sure if he belongs in his own family. But he knows who can and does and will provide that blessing for him. Jacob was a broken man. Physically, relationally, emotionally, only God could make him whole. And so as he's begging for his blessing, the man asked, what is your name? And he replied, Jacob. Deceiver, trickster, supplanter. And he says, no. Your name will no longer be Jacob, the man told him. From now on, you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with men and have won. He replies, please tell me your name, Jacob said. Why do you want to know my name? The man replied. We'll find it out later, I'm sure. But we do know one thing. He blessed Jacob there. When the night started, Jacob was a broken man. Long before God broke him in their wrestling match. Long before God dislocated his hip, he had a broken heart, didn't he? He was all sorts of ways messed up. And only God could make him whole. And when the night ended, he was still a broken man, physically, but God had made him whole. And he became the one who wrestled with God. He became Israel. And so I ask you guys, when you arrived here today, were you broken and in need of wholeness? Oh, I think I have praise team on the move. They figured out that I'm closing. When you arrived here today, were you broken and in need of wholeness? Some of you physically, some of you emotionally, financially, relationally, spiritually. Were you broken and in need of wholeness? When you arrived here today, did you need to know that someone cares for you? I've got good news for you. I know someone who does. I know someone who's ready to take whatever burdens you have and take them away from you because of his love, because of his amazing grace. He will take whatever burdens you have and take them from you. And so our song today, to close, is going to be Amazing Grace, My Chains Are Gone. And I can't help but think that that night, Jacob got to experience that feeling of the burdens, of the chains, of all of the conflict that he had being lifted from him. You can have that too. Just come to Jesus. He'll make you whole.